My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Welcome to the latest episode of Diplomatic Immunity. I'm Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. We talk a lot on this show about what we can learn from history to help us in our current time, and we've touched on this issue with scholars and practitioners in past episodes. We've put some links to those conversations in our show notes. In this episode, I spoke to two diplomatic historians about their research and writing, how they view applied history, and why they believe learning from the past is so important, and also how they try to spread this historical sensibility, if you will, to others. Our guests on this episode are Susie Colbourn and Simon Miles, two stellar early career historians who also happen to be husband and wife. Simon is assistant professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy and in the Department of History at Duke University. He is the author of Engaging the Evil Empire, Washington, Moscow, and the Beginning of the End of the Cold War. Susie is a DAAD post-doctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She's the author of Euromissiles, a Transatlantic History, due out in spring 2022, and along with Timothy Andrew Sayle, is the editor of The Nuclear North, Histories of Canada in the Atomic Age. During our conversation, we discussed an overlooked period of the Reagan presidency that played an integral role ushering in the end of the Cold War, and what we can learn from that in light of today's US-China competition and great power competition overall. We also discussed the cyclical nature of NATO history and what that might portend for the Biden administration in regard to its transatlantic policy plans. It was a fascinating discussion of both history and current affairs. Let's take a listen. Susie, Simon, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Kelly.
Thanks. It's wonderful to be here.
So, as I've mentioned with you guys a little bit, one of the themes that we have running through the show is this idea of applied history, or the notion of learning from history. And you guys are both historians, but you also both approach your work in all of its aspects with an eye towards the present. So just kind of starting off here, I'd like to get your thoughts on sort of what does applied history, or this notion of learning from history, mean to you, and why do you find it to be something worthwhile? Why do you think it's important?
I think that we're all in many ways consciously or unconsciously consumers of history, right? We use it to make sense of the world around us, whether we're thinking about that in a concerted or systematic way or not. But we all use history as a guide to shed light on the present, to figure out where we came from and how we got to the problems we're facing, whether we've been in similar situations before. And so I think that there is a natural inclination to want to go back to the past as a way to understand the challenges we face today.
I think history makes intuitive sense to people, and thus it gives us purchase on the complicated problems that we face in a way that feels, I think, organic. And certainly in my interactions with policymakers, it's what really makes sense and I think has traction. While yes, data and quantitative information is really important, qualitative information resonates, and it resonates with policymakers, but it also resonates with the audiences of policymakers, whether that's peers or whether that's voters. So one thing I really try to do when I teach my students and when we talk about applied history is to really think about not just what we could call lessons of history, that is to say, taking analogies or what have you from the past and to make sense of our world. But I like to, or at least I try to inculcate in my students what I call a historical sensibility, right? Which is not just about knowing facts, but also I think what history does really well is it helps us to understand what we don't know. Learning history, I think, makes you really need to embrace multi-causality, right? Learning history makes you come to grips with the fact, I think, that just isolating one causal mechanism is not really telling the whole story. And thus that as we confront the challenges of the present, we shouldn't just be looking for the magic bullet, right? We need to look at the really complex web of causes that led us there. And I think learning history helps you to really identify differences and irony very well. And I think that's an important element of policymaking as well. And also it helps to kind of identify options, not just in terms of analogies and trying to replicate the successes of the past or avoid the failures of the past. I should also emphasize, but look for example at George Kennan, right? And I really like this story. George Kennan is writing his long telegram about the Soviet Union, but on his bedside table, we are given to understand is a copy of Edward Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. And the idea that Gibbon advances about why Rome falls, which is basically that it contained the seeds of its own decay, kind of helps Kennan to identify this path between total acquiescence to Soviet domination of the European continent and World War III. That path becomes containment. And it's premised on the idea that the Soviet Union too might contain within it the seeds of its own decay. So I think there's a lot of ways that applied history, I should say, feed into not just making policy, but thinking about policy. Not just training policymakers who produce stuff, but also training policymakers as they think about doing it.
I think there's also, if I can build on what Simon just said, right, thinking about studying history as a form of exposure, that the past is sort of a laboratory, if we want to use some sort of scientific language, but that you can go in and be exposed to a wide range of examples from different contexts across time and space. And so when we're thinking about applied history, this idea of what the examples we're drawn to are, and again, coming back to this idea of unknowns, what are the examples we might be overlooking? So Alexandra Evans had a wonderful piece in War on the Rocks in December of last year, talking about how we're sort of naturally right now drawn towards Cold War analogies to explain the confrontation that may be coming with China, right? That's sort of where we're going often. But she raised a very different case from Franco-Prussian competition in the 1860s. And looking at that, right, thinking about where we're drawing our analogies from, it's not to say that one is more compelling per se, but that the process of going back and evaluating how these various examples might fit can shed new light on the situation in and of itself. Even if you decide that the analogy doesn't work, that whole enterprise can be very instructive, I think.
I like to talk to my students about time, space, plus. So time, kind of what we could call vertical history, right? Of what the causes of a phenomenon are or what the consequences of a phenomenon are. That's the linear timeline. Space, I guess we could call that more like a horizontal history, if you will, looking at how different issues are related or interconnected. But the one that I think is having a lot of resonance with at least my students is the plus, right? Conceptual or thematic links that transcend time or space. So students are thinking about issues, for example, in the context of environmental concerns. Right now, of course, a lot of students are thinking about conceptually what major shocks like pandemics do. Migration histories as both transcending and spanning both time and space. That has a lot of resonance these days. And it's those three factors that I think kind of make up history. Each of those gives us purchase in thinking about policy too. What are the antecedents? What are the consequences? What else is going on that feeds into this phenomenon that we're trying to deal with? But also, what are the meta phenomena of which this might be a part, or to which this might speak?
I teach a class at Georgetown on history's influence on foreign affairs, where we look at all this kind of stuff. And I'm using the Evans article this semester. It shows you another angle, another topic or an issue that you can kind of use to try to give another analogy to what possibly might be going on right now. And Simon, I loved, no one would confuse you for a political scientist with your multi-causal arguments. But I mean, I completely agree with you. But I think that's why it's important to have, what you guys both talked about, like this historical sensitivities, if you want to call it that, or this historical knowledge. And I found it even more important for even beyond like talking about applied history or taking lessons from history, but in what's been going on in the world in the last couple of years, and especially here in the United States. I've put more emphasis on the first half of my class on teaching students what is history, to talk about facts and myth and why it's so important to understand how historians write history and what are facts, and talk about truth and how that's been warped through the use of history over time. And I think just in general, the critical thinking skills that go into learning history and reading and researching history are just beneficial for everyone today.
I think that's absolutely right. If I can just say, I think that's absolutely right. And the process of doing the research, if you will, yes, it has utility in various more pragmatic ways, but of adjudicating evidence and judging between competing claims, I think that's a really important exercise. And you, I'm sure, are familiar with Margaret Macmillan's book on the abuses of history, and I assign that to students on a regular basis. It's become, I think, especially pertinent very lately with these sort of dueling, the 1776 commission, now defunct, and the 1619 project. But the history as also being about the stories we tell ourselves, not just how we kind of inform policy, but rather the bedrock assumptions that feed into how we make policy and what we prioritize in policy and what we take as givens, what's unsaid, what objectives are behind policymakers' efforts, which they're not even being explicit about because they believe them to be understood by all audiences. Well, what's feeding into those assumptions? And I think sometimes the answer, as you suggest, Kelly, it could range from a misunderstanding of history to a willful distortion.
If you believe that we lost the Vietnam War just because we didn't send enough troops in and we didn't have enough political backing, that's going to affect your decision making today on what to do in Afghanistan or Iraq or country X in the future.
The classic example of that, of course, is JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And having Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August. And even though that there has been ample historiographical debate about whether her arguments were correct, right? There was a sort of serendipitous moment where, because that book was what he was reading, it shaped the way that he approached something much larger and in many ways unrelated, but it formed a critical backdrop to his thinking.
Yeah, I love that case and that story. To move into sort of more specifics, and we talked briefly on sort of research and stuff, but to talk to both of you kind of now on what you've done in your own research and your own work. Susie, we're going to start with you, and you've done a bit of work on nuclear history, especially as it relates to Canada and Canada's diplomatic history in general and transatlantic relations. You have a forthcoming book on the history of Euromissiles, and you also recently published an edited volume with Tim Sayle on the nuclear North, Histories of Canada in the Atomic Age. As we move forward in a world that needs new nuclear arms agreements, and we both, I'm sure all of us are aware at this point that the Biden administration just extended the New START treaty with the Russians by 5 years. So that was one of the first things the new administration did. The Biden administration is also going to look to shore up its transatlantic alliances and relationships. Are there any aspects of your research that you going through a lot of NATO history and transatlantic relations and nuclear history and things like that? What can you draw on from your own research that could be used as sort of lessons of history?
Yeah, I think certainly right now we're seeing a lot of talk about the future of alliances, with words like rejuvenation and renewal tossed around a lot, particularly with reference to NATO. And I think that the current situation and that conversation, as is so often the case, is really a mix of old and new. Some things and issues that are front and center in transatlantic relations are strikingly familiar with pretty clear echoes to the past. And so here we might think about the ongoing conversation about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That's an example that jumps out to me. I think it's pretty easy to see the similarities between the debates over Nord Stream 2 happening right now and the incredibly acrimonious debates that divided the Western Allies in the early 1980s over the construction of the Siberian pipeline, right? Connecting energy reserves in Siberia to markets in Western Europe. And on this subject, our new Secretary of State, he wrote the book on it, right? His 1987 book, Ally versus Ally, is all about the intra-alliance disputes that had arisen earlier in the 1980s over the Siberian pipeline question. But I think without question, there were also things about the last administration's handling of NATO that were new. But strikingly, much of what seems new to me about the Trump team's NATO policies as a historian of NATO was that much of what was new was about style, the way that US foreign policy towards NATO was presented, not necessarily the substance. And there's maybe a fairly strong disconnect actually between the style and substance of what Trump's NATO policy looked like. But this question of style is actually, in many respects, another continuity. There are so many instances from the alliance's 7 decades where style mattered in its own right. And this is really something that was a major theme I found when I was doing the research for my book on the Euromissiles, which is, so a lot of the book, a key argument running through the book is about the importance of intangibles, right? About confidence and general impressions of a leader's proclivities and styles, particularly the President of the United States. And I was struck doing the research for that book that with presidents in particular, it can be a really long, difficult, arduous slog to change public impressions once those have set in. And those impulses, the reputations they cultivate early in their presidencies can shape so much of the conversation and drive many of the crises. So here we might think of the perennial assertions that Jimmy Carter was indecisive or vacillating, or Ronald Reagan's reputation as reckless and dangerous, right? A nuclear cowboy is how one analyst at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London summed up the way the British public of the early 1980s viewed Reagan. And so I think there's a temptation now, as we have a new administration coming in, to sort of be tempted to dismiss this style, right? So the readouts from early calls, the photographs and videos from, say, Biden's talks with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg as just window dressing, right? A sort of PR stunt. But I think that NATO's past tells us that that's not true, right? These seemingly stylistic things really do matter and can influence the general impression of the alliance and the overall health and vitality of the alliance in ways that really can shape policy in meaningful ways. And so I think that just to sort of zoom out, right, one of the things that I found most striking as a historian of NATO is just the clear continuities and repeat patterns that appear time and time again. When I wrote my dissertation, I remember sitting down to write my epilogue, my conclusion, and I ended up just writing that my dissertation was so repetitive in some places that it might be boring, right? I remember, and my supervisor sort of laughed at it, but he was like, it's true, right? You're just talking about cycles and patterns that occur time and again. And so in thinking about how historians and the study of history might shape conversations going forward, I just want to flag one place that I think might be quite interesting. But we're almost certainly going to see more debates and conversations about how NATO can adapt to the new international landscape, and particularly the rise of China, right? So whether there is a role for NATO vis-a-vis China. And here I think that there are a lot of opportunities to revisit older episodes where the NATO allies debated when, how, and on what terms they would engage issues and questions outside of the treaty area. And I think we can look back to those episodes as places to see what kinds of arguments and counter arguments were made previously, because that isn't a fundamentally new question. There are episodes all the way back to the early 1950s on this. And so I think that going back and revisiting those can inform the conversations we have going forward, even if they don't necessarily provide prescriptions or solutions.
And for the record, no one will think that the book is boring at all. You might make that mistake about the dissertation, but the Susie's book on the Euromissiles is absolutely not boring in any way, shape, or form.
Well said. Well said. Simon, moving to your research next. Your book looks at a period of the Reagan presidency that you call the beginning of the end of the Cold War. While most works on Reagan focus on these last years of the high-stakes summitry or the fall of the Berlin Wall, you recenter these all-important years in order to describe how it set the stage, both in the U.S. and the Soviet Union, for what was to follow. You also looked at a lot of sources that were new and opened for the first time in the former Eastern Bloc and in Soviet Union and stuff, and in other Western allied countries as well. You talk about two tracks of American diplomacy during this period that you call peace through strength and quiet diplomacy. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by those? And then also, what do you think, as far as sort of lessons of history, what do you think are 2 or 3 key takeaways from this period that are pertinent to today?
Happily, I think that when we look back on the presidency of Ronald Reagan, he is sort of the avatar of American exceptionalism, for better or for worse. And that could be a kind of a hero role or a villain role, depending on your political persuasion. But that's the space that he occupies, I think, in public memory. And I was struck when I started researching this book, the extent to which he really comes into office a pessimist. This is not Ronald Reagan the optimist. This is a man who, first in 1976, when he tried to unseat his fellow Republican Jerry Ford, and then also in 1980, when he successfully unseats the Democrat Jimmy Carter, was really pessimistic about where the United States is in the Cold War vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And he's looking at a whole range of information, whether that's the domestic economy, which is still in the pretty brutal throes of the transition to a globalized world economy, when he's looking at certain kind of more actuarial elements of the nuclear balance, and is looking at things like throw weight, which is really just a fancy word for saying how much damage the other side can hurl at the other via outer space, or when he's looking at the situation in Western Europe, and it seems like the stability of the American alliance system is really being strained to a great deal. He's looking all around, and then of course he's looking in Latin America and the Caribbean, I should add, where he sees communism in the form of Soviet and Cuban interventionism on the march. So he comes rapidly to the conclusion that something new needs to be done in terms of what American grand strategy towards the Soviet Union is going to be. And in the book, I argue that he implements a sort of dual track grand strategy to tip the balance of power, which he perceives as being not in Washington's favor, to tip the balance of power in his direction. So, as you say, I label one of the elements of this, which we could kind of call, to borrow the carrot and stick metaphor, this is the stick, and that's peace through strength, right? And this is the Reagan who is probably the best known. This is the Reagan who stands up in Westminster in 1982 and declares that communism is going to be left on the ash heap of history. The Reagan who stands up at the National Association of Evangelicals conference in 83 and decries the Soviet Union as an evil empire, the ideological offensive. I think very important to Reagan's perception of the Soviet Union, I think an accurate reflection of how he saw communism in general. There's the military buildup, ICBM and submarine launched ballistic missile innovations, the B-1 and B-2 bombers, which are nuclear capable. Also, of course, famously, Star Wars, right? The Strategic Defense Initiative, lasers in the sky and brilliant pebbles and all that kind of really good sci-fi stuff. And also working to consolidate American allies persuade, as Susie chronicles in her wonderful book, persuade American allies to house US nuclear weapons in Western Europe. That's peace through strength. That's the well-known Reagan. What I was excited in this book about bringing out was the less well-known Reagan. And that's the Reagan who implements the carrot to go along with the stick, which he refers to as quiet diplomacy. Some episodes of this we know pretty well about, for example, after John Hinckley's attempt on his life in March '81, Reagan handwrites this letter to Leonid Brezhnev from his hospital bed at George Washington Hospital. But there's a lot of it we didn't know, and that this is where some of my sources and working not just out of American archives, but working out of a range of other ones really opened up new doors. So in the book, I chronicle, for example, the life of a back channel that Reagan instituted in Berlin between Arthur Burns, who was the US ambassador to West Germany, and he had a series of Soviet counterparts. Pyotr Grasimov was the first one, who were the Soviet ambassadors to East Germany. And these two normally would meet just to talk about very banal sort of technical things, quantities of rail cars that could pass through East Germany into divided Berlin, overflights, really, really uninteresting, which made it a great back channel because you could have two top-level diplomats meet totally in the open, and no media were interested in the fact that this stuff was happening. And so in the East German Politburo archives, I came across the transcripts of all of these meetings, which I've never found one in American archive. I've found items, for example, from Burns's papers, which make a lot more sense if you know that this stuff was happening. But Burns at their first meeting says, Ronald Reagan sent me here to use this as a conduit for information between the two superpowers so that we can keep the Cold War under control and manage crises. So in the book, I argue that American grand strategy worked because he used both the carrot and the stick in dealing with the Soviet Union, and that the key to understanding the speed and scope at the end of the 1980s, which are the Reagan years, which are much more prevalent in the historical writing, the Reagan years, which are kind of the textbook case of adversaries putting aside their differences and cooperating. And I use the word textbook advisedly because in a great many international relations textbooks, that's the example that this can be done, is US-Soviet relations from sort of 85 onward. The key to understanding the end of the decade is this beginning half, when we have not only a shift from a balance of power perceived to favor the Soviet Union to one more accurately understood to favor the United States, but also from the war of words and back channel dialogues to the overt dialogue and summitry which characterizes the end of the Cold War. So what can we learn from this? Well, I think two things really stand out. And in the first part of this, I'll just build on what I just said. Reagan didn't just apply maximum pressure to the Soviet Union until it broke. And we've read news articles over the last few years that depicted a Trump administration, for example, that understood that to have been what Reagan did. It was all about maximum pressure and then Soviet capitulation. And we're seeking to apply those lessons of history to, as they understood it, to Iran and also to the People's Republic of China. But that's not what Reagan did. He certainly applied pressure. I'm not suggesting for a moment that that's not the case, but he also used diplomatic engagement as a safety valve. He stood up these lines of communication that could be an important check, such that, for example, after the Soviet Union shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7, which was flying from New York to Seoul, South Korea, it was Burns who did a lot of talking to the Soviets, using the back channel in Berlin to make sure that both parties understood that this was bad and it was going to be called out, but also that there were other goals that they shared which weren't derailed by this, like, for example, arms control, intermediate range nuclear forces. And what that meant was that when pressure showed results, it gave the Reagan administration credibility as a negotiator, because it hadn't just been hostility and aggression. There had been small deals made, for example, on the so-called Siberian seven Pentecostals who've been living in the US Embassy's basement in Moscow for the better part of a decade, if I recall correctly. They made a deal on that. Part of the deal was that Reagan wouldn't make political hay out of it, and he stuck to the deal. What did that mean? That meant that when Gorbachev needed to go much, much further, there was a degree of a track record there, if you will. He signs, for example, the INF Treaty, a terrible deal for the Soviet Union, undeniably a terrible deal for the Soviet Union, because not only did he have little choice, but there was also an element of confidence that he would get what he needed from the American side, built up over the years. So that's the first lesson, is I think recognizing the wisdom of using both carrot and stick in tandem, and not just expecting one to do all your work without the other. And I think that, as the incoming Biden team looks, for example, at dealing with countries like China or Russia or Iran, they would do well to take that lesson from the Reagan administration.
In the same vein, Susie, you've recently been editing a Lessons of History section of the International Journal. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, so that our listeners also become aware of that and can go read it. But where did the idea for this come from, and what are some of your end goals for the section, and what are some of the insights that you've gained from this thus far?
Yeah, so the series has actually been part of the International Journal's remit for a number of years, and I think it fits squarely within what IJ's original purpose was. It was to be a source, a place for wide-ranging conversations on international affairs, but also on Canada's engagement with those global issues. So from the time it was created in the immediate post-war years of the 1940s, IJ has always consciously tried to be interdisciplinary, right? A place for historians, political scientists, current and former policymakers to be in conversation with one another, sort of in a common square, such as it can be one on paper. And so there have always historically been historians and political scientists serving as editors alongside one another. So with the Lessons of History section, my goals are pretty straightforward, right? To create a space for historians to explore the aspects of their research that have relevance to our contemporary debates, to issues in international affairs. And here I'm thinking about the kinds of things that often don't make it into your final product when you're working on a book, right? Because your editor tells you, no, it will date your book, right? You don't want to include this contemporary reference because it will change in the 9 or 12 months before your book goes from proofs to appearing in hardback, in paperback, right? Publishing can be, and at times, slow endeavor. But so to create a space for historians to take the things that the connections they see as they're researching a project and put them down in a form that is not a full academic article. So they're all usually between 4,000 and 5,000 words, so about a half article, but just to have a chance to sort of build these out. And so this can mean a number of things. And I've seen a sort of range of ways historians have tackled this, right? This can be taking a particular historical episode from the past and suggesting ways that it might offer lessons for current problems. It can be about how history is already being used in our popular landscape to look at how a particular lesson is being applied for better or worse. We've had authors who have written broadly about the mechanics of writing history, right? What makes the writing of history possible? So we've got a forthcoming piece on this issue, which I'm really excited about, which is about archival access, declassification, and how it impacts what we do and don't know about things that are decades old. In this case, about defectors to Canada during the Cold War and intelligence gathering. So in essence, the goal is not unlike what we discussed at the outset, but to think about how we as historians use the subjects we study to think historically about the times in which we live.
Yeah, and I'm glad to see more and more outlets like that. I mean, we're all aware of sort of the sort of blogs online that kind of allow for lessons of history, sort of applied history to be written. But I think the more venues that we have, the better, especially in academic journals. And, I mean, when I was coming up in grad school and stuff in the early late 2000s, it was, there wasn't a lot of this kind of stuff being done, or not as much of it as being done today. So I think it's good to have the outlets and these venues to write in. Well, listen, I want to thank both of you, Susie and Simon, for joining us today. I thought that was a great conversation, and one we could keep going for well past the limit of our listeners' time. Anyways, thanks again for joining the Diplomatic Community Podcast, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
Thanks for having us.
That was Diplomatic Immunity. Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they listen. Follow us on Twitter at GU Diplomacy, and visit our website isd.georgetown.edu.